Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's time once again for another one of our Atin lay segments, and today I'd like to speak to you about the expression extra mundum. Extra mundum. Extra does not mean more than enough. Extra here in the context means outside of, with that ex prefix, like exit. That's what we're talking about, outside of. And then mundum is simply the Latin word for world. You may have heard the great Saint Athanasius being referred to as Athanasius contra mundum, which means Athanasius against the world. Extra mundum means outside the world, and it is used to help us understand, though how much help it is, I'm not quite so sure, but to try to help us understand something of the relationship between God and his creation, and if I can put it this way, how they sort of relate spatially. Because we want to make sure that we're affirming a couple of truths that might seem to be in tension against each other, but really shouldn't be. Those two truths are simply this, that God is everywhere, and yet God and the creation are not sort of coterminous. They're not the same thing. We don't believe that the created order is made out of God. We do affirm that God, in him we live and move and have our being, that he upholds all things, and that he is everywhere present, but we don't believe that he is, where he is, if you see what I'm saying. There's a distinction, there's an ontological gap between the creation and the creator. So we're trying to remember and to emphasize that distinction and not get God so connected to the creation that he is confused with it. We say that God is extra mundum. He is outside the world. Now, that doesn't mean, and this is a very common sort of perspective that we have, that what we think we're saying when we say that God is omnipresent is that God has that bird's eye view of everything, that because he's above everything, he can see everything, and because he sees everything, therefore it's like he is everywhere. And he does see everything. He is above everything, but I'm not sure that I like that idea that that is the nature of his omnipresence, that it's merely a kind of distant overseeing. God is actually always near. I find it very helpful in trying to understand these things to think in terms of dimensions we don't quite understand. I think about it kind of in terms of quantum phenomena, where we're told things like subatomic particles disappear from this place and they reappear in that place, but they don't traverse the distance. And I think, well, that's nonsense. Unless they traverse the distance in a different dimension that I can't really behold or see. And so I don't mind, I think it's more helpful to see God being everywhere by understanding that he is in the same place but not in the same dimension with all of us. Now, related to this is a doctrine that I'm sure we covered when we did a pretty extensive series on the attributes of God. We want to also affirm what we call the immensity of God. I-M-M-E-N-S-I-T-Y. The immensity of God. And the idea here is not to suggest that God is overweight or to suggest that God is just really, really, really large. Rather, the immensity of God, and it ties into this question of how we understand the connection between God and his creation. The immensity of God affirms that where God is all there. Where God is all there. That is, we don't get to omnipresence by sort of spreading God thinly across the scope of the universe, right? You've probably heard that old insult, your mama's so fat, when she sits around the house, she sits around the house. Well, that's not what we're saying about God, that he's so big that he extends around the whole of the created order. We're saying that wherever he is all there. You don't have the attention of God's pinky, while someone more important has the attention of his ear. You don't have the attention of his earlobe, while somebody else has the attention of his eyes. Wherever he is, which is everywhere, he is all there. He is not, however, everything. He is everywhere, but he is not everything. He is distinct from everything else. He is, in two words, extra mundum. By the way, that's E-X-T-R-A, new word, M-U-N as in Nancy, D as in dog, U, M as in Mary. Extra mundum. I mentioned a week or so ago that I was giving serious consideration to adding a new weekly segment to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, looking at or working through the whole of the New Testament. And this is it. This is the first one. I've titled it Good News. And we're going to be looking going through the book of Matthew. Whether or not we go through all four of the Gospels seriatim, I'm not quite sure yet. We'll find out soon enough. But today I actually want to begin before the beginning. I think it's really important for us, if we would like to understand the good news, to understand the context into which God came. And that context, interestingly, just like for God's people in the days of Moses, how long were they enslaved in Egypt? There's a gap between the end of the life of Joseph and the beginning of the life of Moses of 400 years. And we don't hear anything, we don't know anything for 400 years. The same is true between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. The prophet Malachi is the last Old Testament prophet, and after his prophecy is given, there is no more revelation from God to God's people. Now, we'll see there is some... some nuance to that, I guess, that we'll get to when we read some of the early accounts of the life of Jesus. That is, we're going to talk about Simeon and Anna. So 400 years of prophetic silence. And here's one of the things that's, that had to be perplexing to God's people through those 400 years. You see, on the one hand, God's people had been promised, in all of the prophetic warnings that were given before the exile, and even in the prophetic messages that were given during the exile, there were all sorts of promises about how wonderful things were going to be after the exile. The exile was not designed to destroy God's people. It was designed to chasten God's people. And on the other side, in the midst of the hardship of that chastening, God's people were called to repent and to change and to turn their hearts back to God. And God said, and then we're going to have great blessing. So he had all these great promises. On the other hand, during the exile, we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel interprets, where Nebuchadnezzar saw this giant statue, and it was made of these different materials, and the stone uncut by human hands comes and destroys this great statue, and the statue represents different empires. First, the Babylonian Empire, which Nebuchadnezzar represented, and then after that, the Medo-Persian Empire, and then after that, the Greek Empire, and after that, the Roman Empire, and after that, the Roman Empire divided, and after that, the coming of Jesus. Well, all of those, that covers that whole time frame, that whole 400 years, and there's never a time when God's people are not under the boot of some other foreign power. So they don't get to this place of great joy and great glory. And in fact, a chief function of the book of Malachi is for the prophet to give an answer to the people's complaints. The people are saying, Lord, what gives? You brought us out of the exile, thank you very much, and we're grateful for it, but you promised that we were going to be wealthy and powerful and the head and not the tail, and we're just some backwater administrative district from competing world powers that have nothing to do with us. What in the world? And Malachi says, well, I'll tell you why. And he starts listing off the grievous sins of God's people. You're giving me lame and blind sacrifices. You're divorcing your wives and remarrying. You are not bringing your tithes to the storehouse. You're not keeping covenant with me at all. That whole promise was based on, hey, you're going to do better, and you haven't done better at all. But then at the end of Malachi, there comes another promise. That promise involves the coming of the prophet Elijah. That promise involves, which we know is the message of John the Baptist. So these kinds of, again, the promise is still out there, but then nothing for 400 years. Imagine if you were a regenerated believer, whether a proselyte Gentile or whether a Jewish believer who believed in God's promises, who believed in the coming of the Messiah, all that time of silence. It must have been profoundly difficult and unsettling. And it's into that context that the incarnation comes, first preceded or presaged by the work of John the Baptist. So, next time in Good News, we will break open Matthew chapter 1 and take a look at what we find there. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.